Hi, my name is Victoria Findlay Wolfe, and I'm a designer for Sizzix. Today we're going to be working on the square dance. Are you ready to dance? We're going to be learning partial seams with this little die, and I hope that you're going to enjoy them as much as I do. Don't be afraid of trying something new. Let me show you how easy it is. So today, the little die for a square dance works on the Fabby, the Big Shot, the Big Shot Plus, and the Big Shot Pro. Also, whichever pads that you have can work with the dies. There's various sizes and colors that Sizzix sells. Today I'm just going to use the one that fits the die the closest, and I'm going to work with my Big Shot Pro. So it's fun that we're able to use the die on many different machines. So let's go ahead and start cutting out some fabric. So I've got my die, got a few pieces of fabric here I'm going to lay on. I can cut up to 8 layers at a time. Get this guy through there. Now, I already have a few pieces cut out that I want to work with today. You'll notice that I have some that are squares, a larger square, and I also have some that are cutting the smaller shape squares, because there's 2 different ways that we can use this die. So my sample that I'm going to start with here is showing the half or quarter rectangles. I guess you could call them a half rectangle. Showing how we're going to sew those together, and we also have the little 4 patches. So the little squares will sew together to make little 4 patches. So you have the option of using a full square in the center or using the little 4 patches. So what does a partial seam mean? What it means is we're going to start by sewing our center square onto one of our half rectangles. And you're going to sew and you're going to stop at about 1 inch and leave that unsewn so that we can then add on the second seam and sew that also to about 1 inch. So then we go back and we finish sewing it. And I'm going to walk you through that so you learn that it's not hard to do and you get a lot of really fun results with this block. Okay, so let's start sewing. First we'll do the little 4 patches. Okay, I have some pinks and maroons already set here. I'm going to do the 2 different little colors because I think that looks really nice. It'll look good with my block. And I can plan these all out ahead of time, and I can sew them, chain piece them, get them all done in one go. I'm going to zip one through, and then I'm going to zip the next one through here. So if I had all my pieces cut out, I can get all of these done and then go back and sew those parts together. For today, let's just get the little 4 patch sewn together. Okay, because I have a light fabric and a dark fabric, I'm always going to press my seam to the dark side. And by doing that, when I sew these 2 pieces together then, that way my seams are not bulking up and all ending up on the same side. So I got one seam going one way and the other seam set's going the opposite way. I'm going to pin those seams together because I want those to line up. I pin it at 1/4 inch through that seam and 1/4 inch through this seam. That way I know that when I sew my 1/4 inch seam, those seams are going to match exactly where I've pinned them. Okay, so if I've chain pieced all of my pieces for my quilt, I could do this to all of the sets, pin them, and then zip them through the machine. Do the back stitch. Okay, and there's my little 4 patch. So on the back then, on that final seam, I can either open that seam up or press it to the side. I prefer to open those up and just finger press those. I just find that the whole seam will lay much flatter if I just keep that open. Okay, so now I have the option on my block. I can either put the whole square into the inside, or I could even put the little 4 patch to the inside. For today, let's go for contrast. I like all that color, so let's sew those together. Okay, so I lay the block out ahead when I'm going to sew these because you can get confused about which way these pieces need to lie. So as long as I'm looking at it, I can see how I want to sew these together. On the first pieces of the partial seams, I'm going to look at it as a diagonal. I have these 2 in this corner and these 2 on the opposite corner. Okay, so these 2 are going to be partial seams, these 2 will be full seams. And let me show you how we do that. Right sides together so I can see how to line them up. I'm going to sew from the beginning of my fabric and I'm going to stop 1 inch before I get to the end. 1/4 inch seam, do a little back stitch. I just make note where I need to stop. So there I've sewn my first seam. That's a partial seam. I have not sewn off the end of my fabric. I've left an inch there on the end. Now I'm going to sew this piece onto the next side of the square, and I'm going to do the same thing. I line up my raw edges together. I'm going to sew from the beginning, and I'm going to stop an inch before the end of the fabric. Do my back stitch. And each time I do this, I'm pressing the seams to the dark, going to the dark fabric, so they're going to the outside. Okay? So now that I have those two partials sewn, you can see that when I flip this back over and I put that right sides together, my fabrics are already pre-cut with the little dog ears off, so I know exactly that I'm going to line up my straight edges of the fabric. Now I can continue the sewing line where I started to sew and sew to the outside of the block. And that'll complete the first side of the square dance block. So I've finished that first seam. I'm going to give that a finger press my seams to the outside. This one I'm going to leave for a second. I'm not going to sew that one down yet. I'm going to move over to the diagonal. Now I can sew this as a full seam, and then after I sew that on, I can sew this on as a full seam. And then at last, I'll sew this one and finish that last partial seam. So let's leave that side for a moment. Let's put this right sides together and sew from one end to the next. You can see again the dog ears makes so you know exactly where to line up your fabrics. You can put a pin in there if you need to. I'm going to just line up my raw edges because I know I don't need to pull my fabric. I'm just letting the machine take the fabrics through and sew my straight seam. Okay, so I have that seam now sewn on as one straight seam. Now we're going to put this red piece on, right sides together, and sew that full seam. Okay, again, laying it out. I'll finger press it, but you should be pressing it with the iron. And now you can see there's my last partial seam. I flip that over, right sides together. I make my little dog ears line up and finish sewing that seam. And there we have the square dance block all sewn together. I'm going to give this a quick press, make sure my seams are all laying nice and flat. Okay, and there's the little block. So again, you have that option. You can leave a full solid square in the inside, or you could go and just make a whole bunch of little squares. So there's my little squares there in the inside. I used a red and a blue as a contrasting color. I let the blue every time I make it, that they're going vertical inside the quilt, and you'll see that they kind of twist and they're doing their little dance. I've also used the little solid squares in there. So this is kind of using it as a very traditional pattern, finding light fabrics that you could use so that you're just kind of showing off the center squares of the quilt. Then I also wanted to take a few minutes just to show you all the different variations that you can do with color placement within this block. I'm clearly having a lot of fun with these. I love scrappy quilts, so just by cutting as many different fabrics as I want, sewing them together, but keeping it consistent here, just using the hot pink in the inside is just a nice little play on the color. What if you just want the little dancing squares to happen? So if you use a white fabric all the way around the outside of them, you're going to have all these little squares dancing in the inside of your quilt, really focusing on that negative space. 3 fabrics, a solid with a print and a white in the center. What you'll see is the pattern, depending on how you lay the pieces together. On this one, every time my blocks line up, I'm getting this little kite shape that lines up together. That's doing that as well here on the prints in this layout. But the solids, when they come together, because of the way that I've laid them, if you're using the positive and the negative version when you're cutting your fabrics, here the solids are going to make a rectangle when they line up. So another version that you can do, just using 2 color fabrics. So using a dark blue and using a print fabric, if I continue this pattern and I always have these sections lying together, you're going to get this kind of a kite shape that has little arms that are going to keep repeating just by using the 2 different fabrics. It just completely changes the layout and the look of this quilt. And just one more little sample of just how you can play with different variations of fabrics to get so many different designs, all through playing with the square dance block. Okay, so this is another version of my square dance block. Looks totally different, right? Exact same block, but looking at the color placement. So here we have the traditional version, right? Being able to see the different parts of the block. And this time, really playing with the color and the options, but some of the fabrics that I'm choosing to finish off my square are going to be white, so that I'm accenting the portions that I want in this sort of 3-dimensional looking version. So by picking 2 color cottons that are similar in shade but not quite the same, I'm able to get that 3-dimensional shape where those 2 pieces are coming together to make that kite shape. Okay, and then finishing off the block, as you can probably still see here, right? There's my traditional block right there in the inside, but by playing with that negative space gives me a completely different look. And that is the way that I love to work, is mixing, looking at traditional blocks and then looking at what information is there that I can take out or add in to give yourself 2 completely different looks and lots of different options with my dies. So go and play with a square dance. I can't wait to see what you can come up with.